Today we are going to be talking about making temporary COVID policies permanent. In London, Mayor Khan has unveiled his Streetspace program to accommodate a tenfold increase in cycling and fivefold increase in walking when lockdown restrictions are eased. Over to you, Will Bradley from the Greater London Authority.
Thanks very much, everyone. So my name is Will Bradley. I work at the Greater London Authority. I work in a team that supports the Deputy Mayor for Transport and the Cycling Commissioner. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our Streetspace plan and how we're responding to COVID and its implications for how people get around our city and use our streets. I just wanted to start with this picture and just to pause on quite how strange this is. And I'm sure this is familiar to everyone's cities across the world, but this was taken on the underground a couple of weeks ago. Public transport is just not designed to look like this. In the UK, we went into lockdown on the 23rd of March. Leaving the house was restricted to exercise, to food shopping and for medical need, and to travelling to work only when absolutely necessary and if you can't work from home. We had to quickly make our transport system safe for those kind of essential journeys which needed to be made. We implemented changes like middle door boarding only on buses. We had to close some of our lower capacity tube stations because of staff shortages. We had police out on the streets, checking if people were traveling for their essential journeys or not. So, this is, I'm sure, familiar to you all. But one of the really amazing things we saw a up to 90% drop in the use of public transport, but we saw a much smaller drop in the amount of cycling that we saw. So cycling still represents a relatively small proportion of journeys in London, around 2 or 3%, but growing fast all the time. But without all this traffic on the road, suddenly bikes appeared. And cycling was very much singled out as something that was allowed for our daily exercise. It was encouraged for people to cycle instead of use public transport if they were still going to work for essential journeys. Bike shops were still allowed to stay open, and suddenly our streets were full of all kinds of different people who you wouldn't normally see on a bike. So this is a picture I actually took in central London a couple of weeks ago, just behind the Treasury. Buckingham Palace is to the left of this picture, and this is a street that you would not normally see kids cycling on. It would normally be absolutely jam full of pretty fast moving cars. And the old adage that all of our cities have a very good cycling network, it's just that it's full of cars, has really kind of come to the fore here. As I said earlier, bike shops were allowed to stay open during our lockdown, and we've seen queues not just outside our supermarkets, but outside our bike shops too. So one of this graph kind of really indicates what has been driving our thinking about our Streetspace plan. And as you can see on the left is our kind of typical public transport demand, 2 peaks, one in the morning, one in the evening. And on the right is our kind of our demand during lockdown, but also our capacity as lockdown is eased and with social distancing in place. And what has kind of really driven our need to get people walking and cycling more is that our public transport simply cannot move the necessary amount of people as our lockdown is restricted, and we're going to need millions more journeys a day to be made in a different way. And we cast our minds back to before lockdown. We know with the levels of traffic and the layout of our streets that we had before, we still only saw a relatively small number of people cycling, maybe 2 or 3%, because our streets are just too hostile for cycling. So we've quickly come to this realization. It's, you know, and it's something that many of us have been working on for a long time to try and make our streets safer. But right across all kind of organisations working on this, and at all different parts of Transport for London, you know, people running the buses now realise that we need to get more people cycling in order to keep them moving. And I think the other thing that really kind of drove our thinking around this was seeing what was happening in China, where with lockdown easing was a massive return to cars, and even more cars on the streets than before. And you know, we just realised the city cannot function like that with all the congestion it will bring and all of the worse air quality and road danger. So we've developed our Streetspace program, and we're focusing on 3 principal areas. Firstly, our town centres. We are looking at widening footways on high streets to give people more space to shop and more space to get on and off public transport. This is a kind of a typical main road in South London in Brixton. It's a busy interchange between the tube and the bus. We previously had a bus lane and 2 lanes of traffic. And overnight, a couple of weeks ago, we took out a traffic lane, we widened the footway, and we've left a bus lane and a single traffic lane. And immediately we've given much more space to people walking and to people waiting for the bus. The night after we did it, some local kids went out and chalked up the street just to kind of tell us how they thought about it, which was really wonderful. This is just another example in Camden, where we've taken out a lane of traffic to widen a footway and give people more space for getting on the bus. And this is kind of something I can kind of touch on just at the end, but this point about temporary versus permanent and how we make these things permanent. We are still in the early stages of this program, and we are doing things with temporary and emergency legislation. So this has been done with a rubber curb that could be pulled up again overnight if needed. And we are, you know, I'd be interested to talk about what other cities are doing in terms of making things permanent, because we're still in our early days, as I said, and it's a conversation we need to have. This is a street in Hackney, a busy market on the weekend, which has been closed to, all the parking has been taken away, and it's been closed to traffic 7 days a week. This is what, until a couple of weeks ago, that street typically looked like, and this is what it looks like now. And again, you know, that this street, Broadway Market, it should have been closed to cars years ago. But I think what we're finding is that there is a real a need to do things that have been talked about for so long very quickly now, and we're seeing that really happen all over London. Our second area of focus is our strategic cycle routes. So this is my boss, the Deputy Mayor, Heidi, on a newly created cycle lane on Park Lane, a really famous street that I'm sure many of you have heard of, next to Hyde Park. But until 2 weeks ago, this is what it looked like. It was an urban motorway. We don't have, fortunately, many of these left in central London anymore. But this was one of the worst offenders. It was a 40 mile an hour. Many cars went much faster than that. And again, kind of overnight, we've created a protected bidirectional track for people cycling. As you can see some of our branding that we're using on the street. You can also see that we're using, in this particular case, some barriers and some kind of plastic litter segregation. You can actually see in the far right of the picture a granite curb where that bus stop is, and that was used not because this has gone in on a permanent basis, but because we actually ran out of rubber curbs. So you know, we've had crises with shortages of PPE. We're now having crises with shortages of curbs. So as I said, we're quickly rolling out a strategic cycle network based on what we were already planning before, but doing things much faster. This is a scheme that went in on Friday. you can see where the blue paint ends on the road was the previous extent of the cycle lane. It was actually just full of traffic most of the time. So we've taken out a traffic lane and we've provided this, this extra segregation. That one looks a little better than this one, which again went in the other night last week. Not a particularly pretty one, but you know, already getting people cycling who probably wouldn't have felt safe doing that before. So this is just a kind of representation of our London-wide strategy for our cycle network. As I said, it was what we're doing is very much based on what we had been planning before. We've probably been thinking of that as a 10-year program. We're now trying to do that in 6 months. Our third area of focus is our residential streets, where we are looking to create low traffic neighbourhoods. So this is where we take our streets, which are not kind of high streets and not main roads, but predominantly streets where people live, and we try and reduce some of the rat running traffic on that. This has been pioneered in a place called Waltham Forest in the northeast of London, where we've been working with the council there to create these access-only streets by kind of blocking off rat runs with a simple bollard. It's quite quick and cheap to do. You can drop in a planter sort of overnight. So we're really wanting to do this very quickly. This is an example in Lambeth, where it just kind of shows the way that we try and think about a low traffic neighborhood. So we kind of take the main roads, so the pink roads, and then we try and take out any rat running traffic using bollards or planters or the modal filters, just so that the traffic, the main traffic, strategic traffic is on the main roads, and those residential streets are quiet enough for people to walk and cycle on, for people to play on. You know, we have a lot of pavements which are not wide enough for social distancing, so maybe people need to walk in the road more, but that's only really possible if there's less traffic. So this is already happening. This was last week in Lambeth, one of the new no entry signs going in. This was a little further west in Hounslow, where again, a scheme that was probably going to take about 6 months to go in has gone in very quickly. We've also got a plan for central London specifically, and particularly the City of London, which is one of our financial districts. And here we're really focusing on trying to create the largest car-free areas in any capital city in the world. There's something like close to 100,000 people that work in a square mile here. Most of them walk. 90% of journeys are walked in the square mile. People will not be safe to go back to work if the City of London kind of operates, if its streets operate in the way it did before the crisis. So we're working very closely with the city there to take out as much non-essential traffic as we can, including looking at Waterloo Bridge and London Bridge and restricting those bridges to walking, cycling, buses only. And finally, something we're looking at doing is rolling out school streets. So this is where this is trying to get more kids to walk and cycle to school instead of being driven to school. So we close off the street in front of a school at drop-off and pick-off times, so that you don't get this kind of nightmare of 3 or 4 cars sort of fighting for the space and making it difficult for everyone else. Another thing we're doing is we're playing with our traffic lights to give more time to people walking. So yeah, that's just a kind of a quick run through of everything that we're doing. Just to this point around how we make these things permanent. As I said at the beginning, we're doing things very quickly, which means that we are using temporary and emergency legislation. So at some point we will have to go back and review everything we've done and make these decisions on them being permanent. And at that point we will have to go through a kind of more standard consultation process.